I said 5 minutes, that was 6 minutes.
Amazing. President Metsola,
Come to the Parliament, you'd be better.
Thank you, everyone, and welcome, and President Metsola. It's brilliant to have you here and starting the banking conference exactly as Anna says, trying to make sense of this issue. The theme today is growth in a disrupted world. I think lots of people like talking about disruption. Not enough people talk about growth. So I'm going to really, if we can, focus this time that we have on growth. And just let's pick up a point Anna makes at the beginning. This point that if Europe had been growing at the rate of the United States, more jobs, considerably more tax revenues. If you were in the IMF meetings last week, you saw the forecast for Europe is 0.8%, for the US 2.8% growth in 2024, admittedly Spain 2.9%. Why is Europe growing so slowly, and what do you think is the recipe for growth?
Well, first of all, let me join you, Anna, in expressing my condolences for what happened over the past days. And I came here also with a message on behalf of the European Parliament that we've been calling for many years now, quicker access to financing help for reconstruction of communities. And that is something we called for, especially if we saw the increase in climate disasters that we've been seeing, especially this summer in Central and Eastern Europe. What we've done is going to be possible to do here in Spain. There are many answers, or let's say hypotheses to your question. We tend, on a European level, to blame the capitals. Capitals tend to blame Brussels. A legislation comes and goes. We run campaigns. I'm a politician, I run a campaign. You give your commitment to essentially reply to what Draghi asked us, what Enrico Letta asked us, who's here. Why do we say that we have a single market? We celebrate 30 years of a single market when it's not single. We have, especially in a post-Brexit scenario, when we saw the need to be at 26, much better than we were before, and we still are not. We are facing now a legislative plan which has a choice. Either we are going to focus on implementation of regulation, huge amounts of regulation that we've voted on and are now implementing, or continue to increase the number of regulation that is pushed through from the Commission through the Parliament. For us, it is clear, and this is not only in the financial sector and economic sector, that we need to stop and take stock. Have we gone too far? Have we gone not far enough? Have we gone too fast? And I'll give you a few examples. If it is still today impossible to finance the purchase of a property with a loan from another country, if ETFs are taxed much higher in some countries than they are in others, if you see here, the numbers show us for Spain, the limited growth potential for small and medium-sized enterprises. We talk a lot about our backbone of our economy, smaller companies. If you compare to the ability for you to create a small company, fail, start another one in the United States, we are still extremely far away. So unless in this mandate, and we cannot wait for another mandate, another election to come and go, and we say, let's finally complete the banking union and the capital markets union, then I think we'll find ourselves in 5 years' time where the gap between us and the US is even larger.
So let's start with that. Why has it been so hard to deliver, in effect, a single market for money?
Now, we talk a lot about the elimination of borders in the European Union. We speak about having removed borders for free movement, for travel, for work, but that's where it stops. Access to finance and ability to move money from one country to another is still too difficult. The potential for growth between certain countries in Eastern Europe, and this is against the backdrop of security, etc., but let's keep that separate, to countries that are essentially conservative in the way they grow their banking sectors, they give the possibility for new sectors to open, is essentially the biggest barrier. And we have been, and I've been present in meetings where prime ministers or heads of government have changed their position completely from when they first took office. And whereas before they were more eager to say, look, I need to, if I can say this, I've been told to protect the banks in my country first, and then look elsewhere, those have changed position because they see the growth. Anna mentions the disparate in numbers between what we saw in the United States and what we see today, comparing, JP Morgan, for example, to the largest European banks, and what we've done today to make it possible. If we see the next 5 years, what will happen as we continue to be squeezed between, two examples, the Inflation Reduction Act, our reaction to that, delayed reaction, hoping that it was a climate piece of legislation rather than what essentially was something that looked at protecting the US industry, to, on the other hand, Chinese subsidies on steel, on vehicles, on solar panels. And I think it will be essentially a realization, and perhaps by accident we've been thrown into this because we've had a war, we have a completely disparate energy system. We realized day one of the pandemic that we were absolutely disunited in how we would address a common challenge. Is that because of these, I would call them accidents, we've realized that we have the capacity and political will to act. And it is that political will that we will need to have serious, achievable, and ultimately implementable plans.
So Anna, I mean, you've talked about banking union and capital markets union for years, not least at this conference. What difference would it make, do you think, to growth? And are you losing any optimism that it will ever happen?
Well, first of all, I'm delighted that the President of the Parliament has said, and there's a lot of people here and on the record, that there is a need to pause on all the rules we're enacting. I think that's what you said, and really understand what the ones we've approved so far mean, right? What the consequences are. So, no, I do think that there are certain things we can do in Europe that are not that difficult and could have a huge effect. Some of them are high level and some of them are very pragmatic, right? At a high level, I think, and this is a commission and a government mandate, what is the mandate for regulators and supervisors? Not just financial system, across all sectors. So the mandate today, for example, for the financial is, price stability. One of the reasons that I believe, there are many others, several others, that in the US, the mandate is sustainable growth. There's a debate to be had. It's not for us, it's for governments to decide, but does it make sense as we find ourselves in the lowest growth for decades in Europe and the world, to go to a mandate that is sustainable growth? This is one of the things that could make a big difference because people do what they're told and the mandates are very important. There's a second one which is very pragmatic, which is securitizations. Capital markets union, single market, we all want it. But realistically, when is that going to happen? I've been around for too long now. I've heard too many speeches, too many ideas, and it doesn't happen. So securitization is a very simple way. In Europe, we do, the last few years, 0.4% of GDP securitizations, US 4%. This is billions in additional funding that could be unlocked, and funding means investment, investment means jobs, jobs mean profit, and profit means taxes where we can fund. Because as I said, governments have too much debt already. It's difficult for governments to take on more debt. We need to unlock private investment.
And what's the obstacle in Europe to securitization?
Excuse me?
What's the obstacle in Europe to securitization?
Thank you.
Not you.
Welcome to,
No, sorry.
welcome.
Not you. I'm saying, no, please. I'm not saying it's you. I'm saying I would love you to help me on this because this is a mix of, laws and regulation.
No, but that's what I mean. It's a regulatory, it's a legal framework issue, Anna. It's not a,
It's a combination, I believe, of both Brussels and regulators.
And lack of political will. I mean, if I can finish Anna's sentence.
And President Metsola, can I just ask you that, can we just deal with this, the sustainable growth mandate question? So we haven't really talked about this within the EU for years. We've looked across the Atlantic at the Fed and other regulators where there is this, balance between effectively growth and inflation. How do you deal with the requirement on regulators in the EU to have an eye at all times to growth?
Well, I think that and it comes back to what we mean by sustainable and what do we mean by growth. And even there, you will find different perceptions in different countries of what it's meant. Does it mean growth of the economy at any cost? Does it mean completely separating what we mean by the green transition to the digital transition? Does it mean that when funds are allocated for recovery of economies after a very long stagnated period of non-growth, money that goes straight to government or money that goes to allow for the creation of more private investment? In some countries, and especially in the more emerging economies, that has been a little bit more flexible against the backdrop of lack of regulation, actually, but the EU has managed to shore up the structures there. But when compared to the older economies, the more developed sectors, in a lack of political will to change the barriers, to change the goalposts. And there, I think it's essentially, and when I finished Anna's sentence by saying lack of political will, is because we have had too much of a divide between political leaders that are going from one crisis to another, whether an environmental one, a health one, an energy one, a problem with the neighbor, to actually looking at each other and saying, how are we going to manage to create, how long have we talked about it, a digital currency? How long have we managed to make it better and easier for you to move from one country to another, not only physically, but economically? So for me, if you ask me what sustainable growth is, it is the possibility for everybody to be able to be brought up. In other words, countries that are sluggish, you look at countries that are sluggish, if you look at countries that 10 years ago, Greece, for example, that is a perfect example of how you can manage to stabilize the political system, stabilize the economy, and have a path for growth. And that path for growth, in some of the countries, it's much larger than others. In some others, it is a larger, let's say, jump because of a disproportionate lack of growth during the COVID pandemic. But at most, I think, and this is where Anna and all of you here could help us, is by saying this piece of regulation, this proposal that is being cooked up in a tower is not good for us. So, at the end of the day, that could actually apply to most legislation that comes to us. And by the time we come to the vote and when we say, is this going to work? Is this going to make essentially the lives of our citizens better? Is this going to make our citizens more prosperous? We find ourselves very often at that point when we say, actually, not really, but it's too late.
Well let's talk about AI legislation, regulation, and competitiveness. Competitiveness in a global context. Because Anna picked up on your point about a pause. I was struck by what you said about member state leaders beginning to say, actually, maybe it's time to think differently about banking union. One of the complaints, as you know, from the tech sector has been a reflexive regulation around AI in the Parliament and in the Commission. And I wonder whether you think the view is changing there too, that people are beginning to think more about investment in AI as a productivity driver.
So I think this was a case in the run-up to creating what is essentially the first ever in the world AI legislation. And to be fair, it is being looked at actually by other jurisdictions as to whether they should go down the same route, etc. And it was a question of, will we wait for us to have to regulate in a reflexive manner or try to preempt? And what was the balance we found? Jury's still out on whether we found this balance, not implemented yet, is that can what is something that is essentially growing, that is going to take over a big chunk of our lives, that is going to take over the way the world works, be regulated or not? If it were not to be regulated, would we lose out? Or if we had to regulate AI, and here the European Parliament came in also with an angle of, from an electoral point of view, voter manipulation, manipulation of behavior, making sure that the tools are not used for abuse, privacy, etc., are we going to lose out against a very fast-paced US economy and investment in new companies? My problem, or at least my concern, is that we could have the first ever piece of legislation, but if that is going to stifle innovation and creativity, if we are going to remain the continent, again another example, with the largest number per capita of patents, but none of which are followed through in our continent, then are we restricting ourselves in the first place? Now, jury's still out there. This is a piece of legislation that is being looked at, and you see it, you know, the Australians, the Canadians, the Americans are interested in how we've managed it. We will have an overarching agency that will look at the implementation with individual member states nominating, but even there, we have a classic situation where member states will send their AI experts. Big difference between those member states that have deregulated this part and left AI to, for example, universities, research, banks, or completely government top-down implementation of AI regulation in the legislation. It is going to be difficult to predict, but I still would not, let's say, throw out the legislation as not being the potential for seeing the EU having possibility of being more competitive.
So let's talk about global competitiveness, Anna, because obviously I look at what's happening with Santander, open bank launching, the growth of what's happening in the United States. When you look at the European economy, how worried are you about this level of growth? And what, given, I know I'm going to ask you about an election coming up next week, but there's a new European Commission coming in at the beginning of December. What would you want to see that group do that would make a difference to this growth rate?
So you mentioned the election and you mentioned AI. So I think whoever wins the election in the US, I hope I'm wrong on this, but I think fragmentation, I think America first is a question for both parties, not just one party. So I think whoever wins, fragmentation will not get better. Hopefully not much worse, but there's potential. The second thing is that given that fragmentation, sometimes I hear that through the banks, we might incentivize third-party countries to do the right things on climate. That as we, by regulating and using soft power on the banks, we will make countries outside Europe change. That's not going to happen, and that's going to happen even less in the future. So our regulation and the way we supervise different sectors runs the risk of creating a bigger gap between our growth rates and, let's say, the US. And so I think AI is important, but I think you mentioned that, or you hinted at that, is that we're trying to regulate ex ante in this case. And in some cases, for example, the threshold on computational power that is being set is already happening with current models, right? And so there's the risk, again, that AI harms Europe through the regulation and supervision on banks. Like, self-driving cars. It's a given that if they make a mistake and sadly run somebody over, it's a much bigger issue if it's a machine than if it's a person. It's going to be a much bigger focus. So we have to be careful not to, again, make things worse. And this is really what I think we should have a pause and say, okay, as we do this, what does this mean for different regulated sectors across Europe?
Just to explain, when you talk about a pause, what do you actually mean? Do you mean sort of everyone says, look, we're going to do a full review of regulatory impacts? I know Mario Draghi talked a little bit about this, but what do you actually mean?
Well, it's not easy, and there's different political goals in the Commission and across different countries, but at the end is really being fact-based. What are the consequences? Really working with the private sector. There's many rules, we can give a view, we can help governments can help us. We have great examples of how this collaboration and working together helps. In Spain during COVID, we were the fastest country to distribute EU funds. Why? Because we work with the banks. We're the ones that know the customers. We can allocate capital in the right way. So actually, it goes to the most productive uses. It's an amazing example. And I think as we enact new regulation and supervision, I find sometimes we could have more interaction, with transparency. We're not trying to influence, and it's a much more transparent way of actually trying to get to the right outcome for citizens. I just feel sometimes we try to, things get done that have different consequences from the original intent.
And I think from a legislative point of view, and this would be sort of an ex post analysis of where we've been, is that we find ourselves very often in a situation where we see how a piece of legislation has been or has not been implemented in 27 member states. And we realize immediately that it's impossible. And that if we are not willing ourselves to admit that we went too far or we're asking for the impossible, then we're only going to create another problem by imposing the next piece of legislation, which will be even more impossible to implement. And I think this is self-inflicted. First of all, the impact assessments that we carry out before we propose legislation. Mm-hmm. Which country is in our focus when we propose that legislation? There are some categories of legislation that work very well in very developed economies, but will not work or be implemented well in a country that is extremely preoccupied by a war in its neighborhood. And this is something that perhaps pause would also mean taking stock in a situation where last mandate was hell.
Yeah.
It was hell because everything that we started with in 2019 was upended within a few months and is still being upended. And if we're not flexible or agile enough to say, look, member states need more time to implement the structures that they need or spend the cohesion funds on what? Can cohesion funds be used to address natural disasters? Some things until a few months ago were unquestionable. I mean, you couldn't even ask them, but today we are. Yeah. And that is also kudos to the current leadership that is doing that, and what was previously never done. In other words, you'd say, those are the rules, you need to do them, otherwise we'll take you to court.
President Metsola, can I just finish up by asking you a question as a politician who deals with a lot of politicians from a lot of political parties? And it's not to ask you to predict what's going to put it mildly, not to predict what happens on Tuesday. We have Jim Messina here, we'll ask him to predict what's going to happen on Tuesday. But Anna's point about fragmentation seems like a very big one, whoever wins. And what do you think is the impact, if you like, of the new politics of the United States? What's the impact in terms of continental competition, protectionism, fragmentation, a sense of a European Union that needs to compete as a bloc with, as you say, China and the US? How do you see that impacting politics and politicians?
So no matter what happens on Tuesday, we will have a new president in January. And that matters because the administration will, in any case, be different. I mean, I'll leave it to the experts to go into details, but we should not be naive into thinking that the last 4 years were perfect for the European Union and the next 4 years will be, who knows. From a European Union point of view, what I would say is that we need to look and get our house in order. I was relieved, in fact, to hear the new UK administration to come to Brussels and say, we want a reset, we would like to start talking again. We are aligned on security, on global growth, on competitiveness, on Ukraine, etc., on China. So that is where I think Europe can regain its strength, because otherwise, even if we discuss, and we haven't even talked about India here, in terms of being squeezed out from not being able to find the 2 feet that we need to stand on. Now, as a result, fragmentation at home is also something we need to deal with. We cannot only say that the Congress will be evenly split, the Senate is a toss-up. That makes a difference actually to us as parliaments, because when it came to passing the big financial programs for Ukraine, for example, we needed to see what was happening in Congress, is that we are in a period in the European Union where the long era of government stability is over. You know, the 16 years of Merkel that we used to look at and say that's where Europe is going, or that's where Europe would like to go, is no longer a conversation we have. Prime ministers have extremely flimsy coalitions, very difficult to sustain, sometimes impossible to have a position that is united on practically anything because of an inability to have strength at home. Now, where the parliament that I lead comes in, we are 720 members. Big rise of the extremes, but not without a potentially solid majority in the center. And I say potentially with care, because that majority, the pro-European majority, and with understanding, you know, this was a very difficult election for us, and the frustration that was expressed by our young people, by our agricultural sector here, by the need or the wish, if not desperation, of our citizens to ask us in Europe to tackle migration as a European challenge, to tackle access to finance as something that they want easier, to have better access to housing, anything. That will only be possible if the parliament is not fragmented. Because you can, of course, vote for somebody as a point of protest, but that person is not going to deliver something that makes your life better. So our responsibility is to actually say, look, there's a piece of legislation that's coming through. Do we have a majority for it or not? How do we amend it? How do we leave it? And that kind of move that we make is how it's going to determine the legislative path that we take over the next 5 years. And on most of these subjects, what we realize as politicians, back to this, is that our colleagues across the pond deal with the same issues.
Of course, yeah.
That the frustrations that citizens have with our policy or with what we are not doing is definitely not their fault, but our responsibility to tackle. And that, I think, has taken us a very long time to understand. We spent for far too long, and I come from one of the centrist political families, that you spend a lot of time thinking our voters, no matter what, are going to vote for us anyway. We learned that the hard way. They didn't. And that's not because they think that others will do better policy, but because they just want to protest. And that protest is one thing we need to learn, not by blaming, but by converting that responsibility onto us.
President Metsola, I'm only interrupting. My grandmother told me that you can't be in 2 places at once, but I think you are going to try and prove her wrong today, because you need to be on the other side of Europe at lunchtime. So I'm going to bring this conversation to an end. I want to say a huge thank you to you for making time to be with us all today, and Anna, a huge thank you to you too. Thank you very much. I hope you found this a very interesting Thank you very much. Thank you. Thanks, Anna. Thank you.